have to confess before I get started that I am extraordinarily nervous. Now, I've stood up here in front of you and spoken many times. I've stood up here and cried in front of you many times. But I'm more nervous this time because as a white man talking to you about race and culture, I am terrified that I'm going to say something stupid and insensitive without realizing it. And so I talked to some African-American brothers beforehand that I know are going to love me no matter what. And they gave me some advice. Dylan said I should probably just go ahead and confess this, my fears. And Russ Murdoch Sr. told me to just trust God and speak from the heart. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay? All right. And if I do say something stupid and insensitive, I hope that the many years of goodwill that I've built up that you will gently and kindly instruct me. Okay? Now, having heard Ted's story and having heard Caroline's story, I also fear that mine will be boring by comparison. And if that's true, keep it to yourself. Okay. I want to start with a scripture in Mark chapter 11, verse 17. Jesus has just driven the money changers out of the temple. And it says in verse 17, and as he taught them, he said, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. Now, a lot of times we focus on the thing that they had made it into, a den of robbers. But I think Jesus was also just as angry about the thing that they didn't make it into, a house of prayer for all nations. And I think as we look around, we're a diverse bunch, right? The Garden State Church, we are a house of prayer for all nations. And I think God is pleased with that. But we haven't arrived. And so I appreciate the squad team giving me this opportunity to share my story, because I believe as we know each other's story and can understand the point of view that each other is coming from, we will do a better job of creating a house of prayer for all nations. All right? I'm doing good so far, right? Okay, so here's my story. Ted told his story about growing up in Brooklyn. You've heard of Brooklyn. Caroline told a story about growing up in Hong Kong, and you've heard of Hong Kong, but you've never heard of my hometown. I grew up in a little farm town called Brighton, Illinois, of about 2,200 people, and I grew up on a farm. Now, my dad wasn't a farmer. We rented the farmhouse, but it was a rural community. And in the 7th and 8th grade in middle school, one of the big topics of conversation was, who makes the best tractor? Was it John Deere or International Harvester? Now, the farmer that farmed the property I grew up on had a Massey Ferguson, so I couldn't really get into the argument, okay? But that's the community I grew up in. And my first job was working on the farm. He grew strawberries and hay. So I worked in the strawberry fields, and I put up hay. And this is going to make some of you jealous, I know, but occasionally I got to drive the tractor, okay? All right? So that's where I'm coming from. In the town that I grew up in, almost everyone was white. And when I went to church, I grew up in the Church of Christ, right? And almost everyone was white. Now, interestingly enough, about 3 miles down the road was the Buckmaster Road Church of Christ, an African-American church, a small African-American church. And I would visit from time to time. The guy that led the church there was African, and he spoke with a heavy accent, and his name was Brother Robinson. That's all I ever heard anyone call him, Brother Robinson. And so on occasion when I would visit there, he always called me Tom, right? Long O instead of the short O sound. He always called me Brother Tom. And so he would say, Brother Tom is going to pray for us. And, it was different from what I was used to, meeting with an African-American church. And when I went to school, almost everyone was white. Now, I grew up, again, in a farm town. It was a regional school. 3 towns went in to make up the school. And a few miles outside of one of those towns was a small African-American community called Royal Lakes of about 200 people. And so there were a handful of African-Americans in my school. And they were well treated, I must say. And I think it helped because the school was sports crazy, like most schools are. And they oftentimes were our best basketball players. And I think that might have helped a little bit, but they were pretty well treated. But when I graduated in 1981, I graduated in a class of 166, and 165 of them were white, with 1 African American. And so that's how I grew up. Okay. In the 8 years that followed, I came here in 1989, and I'll tell you that story in a minute. I joined the military, went to college. Okay, so I was exposed to more than just white people in those 2 areas of my life. And in 1987, having grown up in the Church of Christ, at the age of 24, I began to really understand. I really started to seek God at that point and got baptized. Okay. And so really began to understand that part of my journey a lot more. And I began to really look into, what we now call the ICOC. We didn't call it yet the ICOC then. And it's a long story, so I'm not going to give you that part of the story, but I came to the conviction that I needed to move here and be a part of the New York City Church of Christ. I can't really explain. I don't have time to explain to you how I believe the Spirit guided me to that decision. But I packed up 4 bags and I got on a plane and I moved to, I paid for a flight to Newark and ended up in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. And I stayed in the house of Les and Jean Johnson for 4 days. Now, I didn't have a car at this point. Now, where I grew up, there was no such thing as public transportation. I got my first car 4 days before I turned 16. And I always had a car, and now I didn't have a car. And so Les said, we need to get you someplace with good public transportation. So I ended up in the Stegman house. Okay. So the farm boy from Illinois moved to Jersey City. And it was an education for me. It was an adventure for me. I saw people lived a different way than anything I had ever experienced. I had to learn how to take public transportation. I remember the first time I caught a bus in Jersey City. I was on the wrong side of Kennedy Boulevard. And instead of going to Journal Square, I ended up on the southern end of Bayonne. Okay. I didn't know the geography of the place, and I didn't know how buses worked. So I had to learn a lot. And the Stegman place, it was a wild place, but a wonderful place at the same time. Because you can, if you were in Jersey City and something was happening, it was happening in one of 2 places, either at Leo and Juanita Souffle's house on Belmont Avenue or at the Stegman house. And I know some of you got baptized in the basement there. Okay. See a couple hands go up. All right. And I have to tell you, there were 8 people living there already. When I made the 9th person, I think at one point we had 12 or 13 people living there in a 2-family home with a basement. Okay. But of the 8 people that were there when I got there, 2 of them are elders in the church now. Okay. Kevin Finnerty and Chuck Royal. One of them leads the church in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, Dean Bump. Okay. And so there was some great stuff, crazy stuff, but great stuff going on at the Stegman house. And I was happy to be there. Now, I have to tell you this quick Chuck Royal story. Okay. Chuck gave me blessing. He said I could tell this story. Okay. So I came in, they had a surprise party planned for me at one point, right? And somehow I got wind of it, and it was in the upstairs apartment. So I come in, I'm well, okay, okay, they're going to surprise me. And, I knew about the secret. And so I come up the stairs and Chuck meets me at the door. And everybody jumps out, the typical surprise party thing. He says, so did you know about this? And I said, yeah. So he reaches behind and pulls out a plate of whipped cream, hits me in the face with it, and says, well, did you know about that? Okay. Now, I'm going to ask you, don't give Chuck a hard time about this because it was hilarious. All right. All right. Chuck was there and like, oh, okay, I don't know if you should share that or not, but yeah, it was hilarious. Okay. Anyway, as time went by, I ended up working with the teens in Jersey City with Will and Judy Mason and Ray Holt and Chuck and Denise Royal. We were kind of the Jersey teen workers. Then Chuck, as things got more serious with Denise, ended up moving up this way. And I was there in Jersey City with 8 teenage boys, none of whom had grown up in the church. Okay, the teen ministry was a lot different then. We were kind of going out and trying to find teens. And I had 8 that I was working with. 4 of them were African Americans, 2 were Spanish, and 2 were Egyptian. And so it was a diverse bunch. Not long after that, I was there about 2.5 years, I guess, when I ended up moving to Queens so that I could be close to her. And we got married. And then after about 2 years in Queens, we moved back here. But those days in Jersey City were foundational to my faith. I grew a lot. I learned a lot from Leo Soufflé. I learned a lot from Ted Gill, who moved into the Stegman House shortly after I did. We shared a room, actually. And we would have long discussions at night about mistakes that I had made. Okay. He'd say, well, I wouldn't have done it that way. Or, something like that, And I appreciated his brutal honesty sometimes. I learned a lot from Will Mason. And, I've had some time to think about those days. And I developed a lot of lifelong friendships from that time in Jersey City. Nino Torres went with me on my first date with Wendy. Daryl and Allison Jones went on the second one. And you probably know this, but recently our son married their daughter. And so God has brought me a long way from that farm boy in Illinois. Now, I live in a very diverse neighborhood. I come to a very diverse church, and I work in a very diverse school. And God has given me quite a journey, for which I'm grateful. And so that's my story. Thank you. Apparently, I haven't said anything too stupid. Okay. But I think as we work together, let us all know each other's stories, tell our stories, so that together we can make this a house of prayer for all nations. Thank you.